So we've moved forward 32 years from Lochner and from the initial rise of substantive due process and this liberty of contract, this fundamental right that was read into the Constitution. And a few intervening things have happened. And in this case, it takes place in 1937, they've happened pretty recently. When FDR was catapulted into office in a veritable landslide, he also came in with a number of policies that were designed to sort of drag us out of the Great Depression. And amongst those were a number of what were called New Deal policies, which sought to regulate the economy more stringently to sort of bring us out of the Depression. The court was very resistant to this, the court at the time, and so FDR threatened to pack the court, something which has become at least in vogue to talk about in certain circles today, revisiting that idea. Well, what happened is one of the judges, two of the judges actually on the court, sort of switched how they were voting and sort of changed the nature of jurisprudence for the court. And what we're seeing in this case is that has happened. So this case revokes upon a number of previous decisions and sort of puts the death knell to substantive due process. So this case in particular comes out of the state of Washington, and Washington had passed a minimum wage law that applied only to women for a variety of reasons. A very similar law, a law that was struck down in a case called Atkins 14 years earlier. So a female employee in this case sued her employer for back wages she claimed were owed to her based upon the state law. The employer simply looked to previous precedent and said, well, I have a substantive due process liberty of contract right to contract with my female employees for any wage, and so I don't have to pay them a minimum wage. The Supreme Court has said as much. But this time in a very closely divided decision, a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court absolutely disagrees. They argue that this minimum wage law has a legitimate end, and the state has a legitimate end with trying to seek it, meaning to being protection in the health and safety of women, which is a traditional area in which states can regulate. And that the law in this question of minimum wage law is a very reasonable way of actually reaching those ends. This legitimate legislative end overrides any sort of substantive due process or right of contract or freedom of contract that might exist. In fact, the court in this case goes so far as to say the Constitution does not mention a freedom of contract, as the Constitution deals only with liberty and due process. And liberty and due process, as we know, are not absolutes. And so the court in this case specifically overrules the Atkins case, the previous minimum wage case, and really sort of ushers in an era where substantive due process rights fall out of vogue. And understand that substantive due process really was only used for this notion of liberty of contract. So those judges who are in dissent are very, very upset. In fact, Justice Sutherland, who dissents in this case, says something that it seems odd for a justice of the United States Supreme Court to say, because he's saying something that he knows is absolutely false. And so he says, the meaning of the Constitution does not change with the ebb and flow of economic conditions. But that's exactly what happens. And that's exactly what happened in this case. And the meaning of the Constitution does change with the ebb and flow of a number of decisions, or a number of circumstances. So the liberals taking a lead in this area have really put a stop to substantive due process rights and mainly the liberty of contract. But liberals in the future will find that substantive due process rights can actually help them achieve their ends that they want in terms of policy goals as well. And the court sort of signals this a little bit in Caroline Products, which with footnote 4, they sort of signal that they're open to protecting discrete and insular minorities in a fashion that they haven't before. And the only really way by which they would be able to do that, barring the 14th Amendment, is through substantive due process rights. So from this case to Caroline Products, which happens just a couple years later, or literally 1 year later, in this particular case, the liberals on the court have struck down substantive due process, or the notion of substantive due process. It's fallen out of vogue completely within the legal academy of the time. And they sort of signal end to this idea of the liberty of contract. But it doesn't take a long amount of time for the court to realize that this substantive due process, this tool that exists within the Constitution, can be used to benefit the goals they wish to accomplish as well. And they might not be economically based, but they can push forward some things that may be considered fundamental rights into the Constitution through this substantive due process. So in the first case in Lochner, we see the rise of substantive due process. In West Coast Parish, we see the fall of substantive due process. And in the next case we're going to do, we will see the rebirth of substantive due process in a very different fashion for a very different sort of policy, but understanding that it still is substantive due process that is doing the work.